Hello, and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line. We start out in the direction of Avdiivka here in the central part of the Donetsk region. We see that the Russian forces managed to advance slightly here to the northeast of Wasteyard. It's their first advance here on the southern part of the front line since the start of November month, so a week ago since the latest developments here. And as such, we see that the Ukrainian forces are putting up a heavy fight against the Russian forces, and the Russian forces are slowly advancing. And the fighting is very extensive and causes heavy casualties on both sides, as we see that the Russian forces, with the initial armored assault, had a lot of armored losses, and since then it's been more infantry focused, and as such, there's been more infantry losses in comparison. And the Ukrainian forces have been detected multiple Leopard losses, among other armored vehicles as well, in their defense of the city and the surrounding areas. So we're seeing that there's heavy losses on both sides in this part of the front line. As this sort of defenses that we see here around Avdiivka is not unlike the Zaporizhia front, where in the Zaporizhia front we have a very extensive trench network that covers the whole front line. Here we have more separate and independent pieces of defenses, something like this, where there's a wall here and then something here, a wall here, and so on. So each of them, the Russian forces go through one by one, trying to take control over them one by one. And as such, it's much smaller assaults, and it hasn't been going on for too long. It's been going on for about a month now, this Battle of Avdiivka, and as such, the casualties haven't built up yet. In comparison, if we take a look in the Robotyne direction, where the Ukrainian forces, despite all of the losses throughout the now 6 months long offensive, they are still continuing their operations here in the southern front, in the proximity of Robotyne. In this direction, we see continuous fighting, especially by Robotyne, where here in the southwest of the village, they have managed to advance multiple times, and then one single advance here to the southeast over the past 24 hours. So we see that despite all of the losses, they continue fighting. And when I talk about all of the losses, I don't just say it willy-nilly. I have these 5 pictures here showcasing a lot of armored vehicles and tanks of the Ukrainian forces lost in the Robotyne area. The first picture here shows 4 armored vehicles lost here to the southwest of Robotyne, and with the location, it is something that I haven't shown on my channel before. The second picture shows an additional 9 armored vehicles and tanks here to the west of Robotyne. And with this third picture, we see an additional 4 armored vehicles and tanks to the southeast of Robotyne. And with the fourth picture, we see additional 3 losses, armored losses of the Ukrainian forces in the vicinity of Robotyne. And with these last couple picture, that I call it a fifth one, we have an additional 4 armored losses by the Ukrainian forces in the proximity of Robotyne, for a total of 24 armored losses unaccounted for on my channel that have popped up in and around Robotyne over the past month of fighting. So with this, we see additional armored losses on the Ukrainian side, despite the fact that they have relocated and rotated the 116th and the 47th Mechanized Brigades to the Avdiivka area. So we see that the Ukrainian losses continue despite the continuous assaults by the Russian forces in Avdiivka. They continue their own assaults here in the Zaporizhia front in the vicinity of Robotyne, where they just face off against the Russian forces in their fortifications directly head on without air superiority and all of the other requirements that Zelensky himself lists out in his The Economist article. So this raises the question, why is he actively pushing and launching offensives when he's aware that he lacks 5 very important factors that puts him into this stalemate? In a stalemate, you're not forced to launch attacks. You can continue being on the defensive. If Zelensky builds defenses, he's in a much better position than continuously launching attacks head-on against Russian fortifications. It makes no sense. Not to say that the Russians are doing any better in Avdiivka, storming the Ukrainian positions here, as the fortifications simply at this point of time, the armies have not adapted to the situation to perform proper assaults. We've seen how the drones and the accuracy of the artillery and the extensive minefields are just simply holding back all of the offensives launched by both sides in this conflict. Ever since last winter, we have not seen any major advances by either side. This is mostly due to the fact that if one side decides to concentrate their forces, they're just instantly hit by multi-launch rocket systems, by long-range rockets, and so on, both on the Ukrainian and the Russian side, as the Ukrainians have accurate multi-launch rocket systems with the HIMARS systems and reconnaissance help from NATO allies. So we're seeing that the Ukrainian forces are able to locate Russian concentration of forces and attack Russian concentrations of forces. At the same time, the Russians have their own satellites, they have their own reconnaissance systems, and they have their own multi-launch rocket systems and rocket systems in greater numbers. But they are also able to detect Ukrainian concentration of forces. So whenever concentration of forces happen, they are attacked by long-range weapon systems. So with this, we see that it is very difficult for an attacking force to concentrate a large enough force to actually launch a proper offensive. And therefore, we see that there is this continuous fight where they end up using small contingents of troops, whether it be tanks, armored vehicles, or just infantry trying to storm positions that are heavily fortified, and they usually don't end up well. As we can see, all of the advances throughout this period of time is just small ones where they fight over forest patches. And despite the Russian superiority in their air force, they have a much grander air force than the Ukrainians have. They're still not able to use it to the fullest, because if the Russian jets get too close to the front line, the Ukrainian air defense will shoot them down. The Ukrainians have a sophisticated air defense. Prior to the war, they had over 100 S-300 systems, and they've received numerous Patriot missile systems, IRIS-T systems, and so on. So they're able to have a very strong air defense all over the front line. The helicopters fly very low whenever they're in any missions to avoid the detection of the radars and so on, and to avoid getting hit by these long-range air defense systems. And the jets simply just don't get closer than about 80 kilometers from the front line. This is why we're seeing the extensive use of the glide bombs, because they can launch them far away and they land accurately. The issue with these glide bombs is that they can also be shot down, so the Ukrainians have started shooting down these glide bombs with their own air defense systems. Of course, this is a very expensive endeavor, however, it saves Ukrainian lives in the process, the Ukrainian soldiers. And in the end, it's the United States and Europe that pays for it. After talking with a Russian officer, I realized just how difficult the front line is for both sides. Despite all this propaganda we get from both sides about how the front is going very well, the situation is very good for both sides somehow magically, but in the end we see that the Russian sides are struggling very hard, the Ukrainian side is struggling very hard, they're both suffering huge casualties, and they're both incapable of launching a massive offensive, because as soon as they even attempt to concentrate their forces, they end up getting shot by rocket systems and so on. So what we are seeing is a stalemate, not because one side is unable to break through the defenses, but because neither side is able to concentrate enough forces to do so. There is enough forces on the front line, there's enough forces in reserve, there simply is not the ability to concentrate these forces, because just a group of 1,000 soldiers on each side completely prevents the whole country, the whole army, from concentrating forces. This is why we are seeing extensive rocket launches by the Russian side all across Ukraine to attack the energy system, to attack the weapon deployment, and so on. This is to, one, grind down the Ukrainian weapons, their supply lines, and everything else in between. And the second one is to decrease the will of the Ukrainian people to continue fighting. If they're able to completely destroy the Ukrainian energy system and the Ukrainians have a dark and cold winter, that will decrease their morale, whether they want to or not. Whether they want to fight or not, they cannot fight forever in the cold. And therefore we see that when this fight continues, the longer it goes on for, if the European and United States support for Ukraine dwindles, if it slows down, the Russian advantage will just continue to grow. The United States and Europe already do not give the necessary help Ukraine needs to beat Russia. If it goes down, then it becomes that much more difficult for Ukraine to even keep fighting. Therefore, we see that behind the scenes, there are calls for a ceasefire, there are calls for negotiations, even at the cost of territory for the Ukrainians. This is all because European nations like Slovakia and Hungary are completely refusing to send aid to Ukraine. Poland has said they will stop sending additional weapons to Ukraine. And now we are seeing that the United States is having difficulties passing the budget, but the European Union is having difficulties passing the budget. And the situation just doesn't look well for Ukraine in the long term. And I'm going to end off this video there. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.